week of January, and the most very recent political debate this month has been the big voting rights bill. I have been in favor of federal government intervention. Here's why. Constitution does give the federal government the right to intervene when there are states that oversee their own elections and kind of try to color outside the lines. As a Georgia voter, this is particularly close to home because of what was happening during the 2020 election. The amount of pressure that was put on our state elected officials to change and override the outcome that was certified and audited. Believe me, my father's in the Republican Party, and I hear all of his failed attempts to weed out some of the heavy bias surrounding this election and his questions about how it was counted. So I can give you both points of view. My father's point of view is that Brad Raffensperger made some changes to the election procedures in the spring of 2020 because of the pandemic, but did not go through the proper channels, did not pass it by the legislative bodies for approval. And that my father's opinion and feelings about this were that this was not the right way to do things and that it created problems and inability to check against voting records with ballots that came in. My opinion at the time of the election was that you could not penalize people who showed up to vote under the procedures that were set. So whether people in the Republican Party didn't like what Raffensperger had done, I have a great deal of compassion for Raffensperger. He was responding to an impossible scenario with a pandemic that made voting very difficult and dangerous for many people, and he was doing his best to adapt and make changes he thought would allow the election to proceed smoothly. The time for those changes, as the Republican Party has done in Georgia, is after the election. So they have tried to make some changes, not all of which I agree with. The other problem is the pressure, and I'm very thankful to Raffensperger and to Kemp for not bowing to the pressure, for acknowledging as a voter writer, Georgia voter, I have a choice. I have a choice which party I vote for, and they should not override the choice that I make on that day. So I do appreciate that the elected officials did their jobs according to our state constitution at the time. I am afraid that elected officials might try to be installed in Georgia who might not do their job according to the Georgia Constitution and might try to do illegal things in future elections. For this reason, I am in support of federal law intervention to prevent anything like that from happening. My father asked me what my particular objections to the new Georgia voting law was, and I noted two. And this goes for the federal bill as well. Georgia has a very large minority population, particularly in the Black community. My position has been, and my father has reminded me, he grew up in the Jim Crow South. He grew up in a time when Black people were beaten and told they were not allowed to vote. My father did not agree or appreciate that time and longed for a time of change. My opinion, in contrast to my family that has been involved in the civil activities of the country for hundreds of years, is that these families who have been in the country for the same amount of time have as much right as my family does to be part of the civic process, and were shut out for far too long. In addition, there will be differences as a result, as a consequence, that they were discouraged and not welcome to participate in the civic process for so long. In my family, we have generations of history of civic and political discussion. My father was related to former Secretary of State for several decades in Georgia and had many opportunities to sit in his office and talk about Georgia politics. That comes home to my family, and we have context, and we talk about the political debate and discussion that shape our voting decisions. And that's because we have that history in our family. Because some community members and some members of our voting community don't have that same welcome. They don't have families who were welcome into the political conversation for generations. They don't have that same perspective, and I fully believe that they should be welcomed more to that conversation and to participation in our civic discussion. I think that they should be encouraged to learn the discussion surrounding the way civics work in the U.S. government. I think that there should not be laws passed to try to discourage them further from that participation. I think there should be more welcoming attitudes, encouraging them that their voices are welcome and part of the civic dialogue, rather than further efforts to shut them down or even being neutral. I think there is cause to have a very outreach and welcoming attitude toward voting members of our communities that have been shut out for a long time. The 2020 election in Georgia had the highest voter turnout in history. My father has been a poll worker for several election cycles. He said the normal number in our precinct, we have one of the highest voter turnouts in the state. He said the average is about 50%, but since in the last 5 years, it's been more along the lines of 70 to 86% voter turnout. And we have one of the highest turnouts in our voting precinct, but he said it has been the same across the state. That means higher volume of voters at the polling places and the polling workers being overwhelmed with higher vote counts to tally. If this is also the case in the Black community, then it does support that there should be the creation of more polling places, not fewer. So the first point about the new Georgia law, which I object to, is trying to limit access for Black voting communities because they are also having a higher turnout. The voter numbers support the need for more polling places, not less. The second point that I had raised objection to was that the new law in Georgia required oversight by elected legislation. I already had problems with Governor Kemp's campaign and election for governor when he was Secretary of State, and there was a conflict of interest. So I think there needs to be more done in Georgia where elected officials are not allowed to have a conflict of interest overseeing elections that they are part of. Where they're a candidate, they should not be allowed to oversee that election. So I think that the part of the law in Georgia that allows legislators to have control over elections creates a lot of conflict of interest problems for me. That said, I have similar reasoning behind supporting the concept of the federal voting rights bill to provide protections for the state legislators who do try to do things like not create polling places based on actual voter turnout. I feel like if you have populations with a certain number of voter turnout, it's like the census. You assign polling places that support the number of voters. So if you have 100,000 voters then you should assign polling places incrementally based on some kind of ratio to the number of voters, like 10 polling places for every 100,000, for example, hypothetically. So I think that those decisions should be made based on data and statistics, not based on which communities you want to vote and which ones you don't want to vote. And I do want the federal government to have some ability to intervene if there is election, a candidate in an election tries to change the outcome of any election. I know it's illegal. I'd like it to see a law stating that it's illegal to remind people